Good afternoon. It's a privilege to be here, so thank you for inviting me. It's also very humbling to see so many of you here at this time. This is actually a time where people wouldn't mind taking a little nap. But since everybody's still here, well, thank you very much for taking the time out. The panel discussion will actually wait for a little while because I'm going to just talk a little bit about the work I do and try and fit it in the theme of Rotary this year, which is bridging continents, building communities. And I'm going to give a chance to Janani and Suhas also to talk a little bit about what they do, and then we're just going to open up the session to some questions, and I think I'll moderate the session. Just want to briefly touch upon a couple of points. Look at people like Mahatma Gandhi, Adolf Hitler, Mark Zuckerberg, Barack Obama, Osama bin Laden. All of them, you could argue, in the last 110 years have changed society. They've brought about change. They have, in their own ways, bridged continents and built communities. Take another example. Every day this week on your TV screens, you've seen images from Egypt. An internet-fueled popular uprising is bringing a 30-year-old dictatorship in that country to its knees. 5 years ago, a similar popular unrest in Nepal ushered out the monarchy. The king was gone. 3 years ago, a military dictator in Pakistan had to step down because his people no longer wanted him around. These are all examples of people and societies building communities, bridging continents. But we too do the same in our own lives. You as Rotarians and I as a journalist. Let me give you a quick glimpse into my life. I think you've seen the slideshow, you have an idea. Basically, I do an interesting job. I meet interesting people, I travel abroad, I report on leader after leader, explain why India's profile in the world is growing, why India is getting more powerful around the world. I report on countries coming together, I report on countries drifting apart, I report on countries rediscovering each other. So in a sense, I routinely capture and reflect the interlinkages between communities, countries, and continents. But there are some experiences that stand out, and these are experiences which stand out because I've learned some lessons from them. Recently, I wrote a blog, and this was a blog that made its way to the foreign ministry in Israel, in Jerusalem. I wrote a blog about how, when Israel was battling its worst disasters in recent times, which is the fires in the Carmel region, it had actually asked for help from a lot of countries, and all the Arab countries came and helped Israel. The Palestinians helped Israel, but the one country that did nothing, that actually pretended that nothing was happening, was India. India did nothing, even though the Israelis specifically asked for help. And that hurt Israel a lot, because Israel is a very important friend or ally of India's. I was moved enough to write about it because actually I was in Israel the year before. I had traveled through that country, and especially that region that was hit by the fires. I had experienced the warmth of the people. The scenes that were being ravaged were familiar to me. So I felt moved enough to write about it. And it earned India some friends in Jerusalem. At a time when the country was hurting from India's reaction, that one blog that was read and appreciated in the foreign ministry, I think, earned some friends for India and Israel at a tough time. So lesson number one, you don't have to be President Obama to make a difference. We can all make a difference in our own little way in our daily lives. Another experience that taught me something. I wrote an article on Nepali boys working in a Jaipur hotel. Okay, I wrote about this basically asking Nepali political leaders to stop playing politics with what is called the India-Nepal Friendship Treaty. This treaty actually allows a lot of Nepalis to come to India and work to live a better life, a life that they would not be able to get back home. It gives them choice. When I wrote that article and it was published in a Nepali newspaper, I got a lot of feedback from friends in Nepal. When I say friends, I mean people who didn't even know me or I didn't know them. They just wrote to me saying they were just glad that somebody had written this down. They felt the same way, but they couldn't say this in Nepal because they would be branded as agents of India. But they were glad somebody had made that point, even though that somebody was an Indian. So lesson number two, it's as important sometimes to be an agent of hope as it is to be an agent of change. Recently, I've been covering a story extensively, and I'm sure a lot of you would be familiar with it. It's about Indian students studying in a school in America, which has now been investigated for immigration fraud. 95% of the kids actually come from Andhra Pradesh. We're talking about some 1,500 students in all. They went to America looking for an American dream, an American job, an American car, maybe even an American dog, but now they're being investigated by law enforcement officials. Lesson number 3, there are positive ways and there are negative ways of bridging continents. We as a society do not want to bridge continents in a negative way. We need to remember that. This story is also a reminder that community leaders must set the right example. In this particular case, because as a journalist I've covered the story, I know that there were people from within the community who were aware that this school was not a legitimate school, that it was doing something wrong. These people knew, but they were encouraging other people from Andhra Pradesh to come and join in the school for whatever reason. The community leaders, I feel, let their community down. So here's a lesson. We deserve courageous, principled, morally upright leadership, not just from our political leaders, but from within the community, from you, from me, from all of us. We all have a role to play here. Just to illustrate the scale of the challenge that faces us today, I've recently reported on a diplomat, Anil Verma, who was abusing his wife, physically abusing his wife when he was posted in London. This person's job was to improve relations between India and Britain. What he ended up doing was damaging this relationship. Excuse me. He had to literally leave London, run away, and he got the two governments actually fighting with each other. So he let every Indian down, apart from just embarrassing India internationally. Excuse me. There was another diplomat recently who got into trouble because he got drunk on a flight when he was going to his posting in New York. And he acted fresh with the people who were his co-passengers. And as a news anchor, I constantly get you news of chief ministers and now even chief justices being investigated for criminal conspiracy, for frauds, for scams. I'm beginning to wonder if money and power are overshadowing duty and moral values. I'm asking myself, how will this emerging power, that's India, lead the Asian century? This is what the Prime Minister has described the 21st century as, the Asian century. So how will India lead this Asian century when its moral core is being hollowed out across various areas? This is something for all of us to ponder on. I'll just briefly touch upon the role of the media bringing communities together. I reported on a story that has to do with Indian students studying in Australia. There was a time about 2 years ago when many of them were getting assaulted in Australia. At that time in India, there was all this talk about racist Australia. The whole country had been painted as racist. When I went there and I investigated, I discovered that there were many layers to the story. These were actually not just students, but also people who were looking to work in Australia in whatever way they could. There were social fault lines. These are boys and girls from Punjab, from Andhra Pradesh, who couldn't adapt to local cultures. They were unwilling to adapt in some cases. They couldn't speak the language in other cases. There were many different fault lines. It was not a black and white story about bad policing or racist Australia. 2 years later, I think the coverage that I started off and then the rest of the media also picked up made both governments understand that this was a complex issue, and with understanding comes better policy options for governments to deal with. I will be dishonest if I don't concede that sometimes media can be a part of the problem. We sometimes magnify differences, we sometimes create differences where they don't exist, and we do that by irresponsible reporting, we do that by sensationalism, we do that in inbuilt biases in our stories and the way we report them. So yes, we are a part of the problem. One example it can come to mind immediately is there was recently a story about Tamil fishermen who were allegedly assaulted by the Sri Lankan Navy. And I say allegedly because the Sri Lankan government reportedly and consistently denied it. But this was a story that was treated very differently in the local media, that's in Tamil Nadu, and in the national media. That's because many of the local media are actually owned by politicians. So I think I need to stop talking. So there was an inbuilt bias in the way the story was being reported. So sometimes we need to understand that when you're reporting news, other than just the news, many other considerations also come into play. I would urge you all to consider that. Often the poor reporter doesn't have a choice, and the people who own the channels, who own the newspapers, who are our editors, who are our bosses, also need to do some soul searching. My final thought is on the youth factor, because we have two super successful young people with us, and because this is a session on youth. I'm still in my 30s, and that basically means I'm a product of the internet age. I blog, I tweet all the time. When I'm filing my stories, I go around with my BlackBerry. My story often is out on internet before it's out on TV. I get feedback on my stories from people around the world in real time. So yes, that is because I'm a product of this internet age. And therefore, I believe my age is a huge advantage in the job that I do. The disadvantage is the normal one that comes with lack of age, which is experience. But I believe that a lack of experience can be more than made up by hard work, dynamism, the attitude that you display. I can do it. Everybody can do it if you have the right attitude, if you're willing to work hard, if you're willing to innovate, think out of the box, and take risks. I'm going to leave it at that, and you don't have to take my word for this. I think you just need to ask the next two speakers, starting with Suhas, what the right attitude